Good afternoon, everybody. A happy warm welcome from Berlin to this FISITA online conference about carbon neutral mobility. My name is Philip Ellert. I'm from the German Association of the Automotive Industry, and I'll be your host for the day. We'll have two presentations about carbon neutral mobility. And I would like to start with a big thanks to the organizing team of FISITA, Philippa Morel and her team. I'd like to also remind you that FISITA is a facilitator and provider of this content and is not in any way responsible for any of the content which is presented by our presenters. We'll have the possibility to ask some questions. You can post them in the chat. They will be collected by the team, and we will select one or two questions per presentation, which will be passed on to the presenter after the presentation, and further questions will be collected and made available after this conference. So please feel free to post questions in the chat. I'd like to give a quick run-up and introduction to our topic. I myself work for the Association of the Automotive Industry in Germany, and I'm responsible for the climate protection policy in our association. So we are facing times at the moment where climate protection is of staggering and growing importance. We see that the whole theme around climate change and climate change protection is really rising. It's now 10 months down the line that the European Union has introduced its latest proposal about the European Green Deal. And the Green Deal indeed puts up a new level of climate change ambition, climate protection ambition. And we are facing really ambitious goals that are probably very hard to reach with the existing legislation and with the technology that we are having available at the moment. So this afternoon's session will address future ways to carbon neutral mobility and all the different policy measures and technical aspects we need in order to achieve the overall goal. Now, we have a slightly changed running order today. It was foreseen that we start with Björn Novak from Bosch, but Björn is having trouble dialing into our system, so we swap the running order, and we'll start the first presentation by Kerry George. Now, Kerry George is Vice President and Head of Sustainabilities at Everledger. Everledger provides emerging technologies for a variety of sustainability and circular economy, as well as social impacts and business needs across various supply chains. Her presentation will be on the latest changes in the EU taxonomy legislation. Thank you very much, Kerry George, for being with us. The floor is yours.
Kerry George from Everledger. I'm the Vice President and Head of Sustainability. We are so excited to be presenting today on some of our investigations on carbon footprinting in the mobility sector, particularly Scope 3 reporting, and to be able to give you some of our ideas and opportunities as well. First, let's talk a little bit about why GHG measurement and GHG measurement through blockchain can be not only effective, but more efficient than what we've seen to date. Starting off with some of the discussions that are going on in the regulatory environment, particularly those regarding the EU taxonomy. We understand that climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation and reporting around efforts to enable those goals are going to be critical. One of the three components of the EU taxonomy criteria, when we look at this, to substantially contribute do specifically no harm, and comply with minimum safeguards are going to be essential to be able to demonstrate in your supply chains and your products. We also see a number of these activities align and goals for reporting align with sustainable development goals, as well as what many companies to date are looking at for their net zero emissions. And finally, and not unsurprisingly, we see that many of the activities that we're seeing in the regulatory environment reflected investments and in banking when we've seen BlackRock and others take leadership positions on climate goals and climate reporting. Let's talk about then how you actually get to the Scope 3 reporting. If we talk about, for example, the battery sector, and this can be in electric vehicles, it can be in portable electronics as well, but it can be for many different materials, whether that be of interest for you for mica, tires, other materials, and other products as well. Getting to the Scope 3 when you're actually talking about the upstream reporting is what becomes most problematic and oftentimes prone to errors in the calculation. And there's a number of reasons for that. But the primary reason is we don't have control. This is beyond your direct buying relationships, usually beyond your direct logistics relationships, and so on. And when we look at the cost and resources, it starts going beyond just staff time to collect this information. When you get to a Scope 2 or Scope 3, you're oftentimes having to purchase information, purchase credits beyond what would be your normal operations activities. And there's also just the time and expense of engaging with those supply chain actors and logistics providers to disclose this information and make sure it's disclosed at a level of robustness that you are comfortable with. And so what we are looking at is how do we ingest and take in different data sources in a responsible, effective manner to enable these types of reporting frameworks and regulatory requirements, but also in a way that is more cost effective than what we've seen to date. And a couple of the things that we've identified is that there are going to be different levels of the supply chain with more or less robust data that you as a company or you as a membership body might have directly, but that when you combine it with permissioning private data, you can have a much more robust ecosystem to do this as effectively as possible. Just quickly, we wanted to show some costs, to put some real numbers on the page. Just for doing one supply line of cobalt for 2 different mine sources could cost you up to $6,000 plus the 40 hours of staff time. This was just something we had a master's of business student do just to demonstrate and have some real numbers on the page of what does this really cost companies. I've had to do this myself in a company, and I only did it for a handful of supply lines. But when we're talking about the mobility sector, the number of materials, the number of suppliers, the number of supply chains are so exponentially great that the cost to do this without it being technically enabled it could be astronomical. With technology, with a combination of data sets, and with permissioning data from actors, you'll see a vastly different scenario that can be quickly uptick. And just a breakdown of how long it took for different research, the availability of public data in the case of GHG for carbon footprinting for this cobalt supply line. What we found is that it was very difficult to find information for refiners that would be publicly available. And so we would have to buy certain specialized reporting on it from different websites. And this is something I managed a team working on about 40 materials at Apple. And this was pretty normative for me to have to purchase different data sets in order to not only map the supply chains of those materials, but then get the necessary data that we were looking for. So what are we building today? We're looking at a combination of reporting different types of supply chain related data with direct data from those actors in the supply chain, as well as third-party data and expert data. This enables a cleaner reporting for carbon footprint and across the supply chain in a unique way. We use a combination of blockchain, AI, Internet of Things, and other different types of forensic technology. And this is what enables us to not only get the data, but then perform different types of calculations. We sit on the Global Battery Alliance, and there's one working group that is looking at greenhouse gas emission reporting. And there's going to be a number of what's called on the far right here in the corner, CO2 emission factors. And we can apply and publicly report or report to you which public types of emission factors that we would use to make these calculations so that you can use what is applicable to your specific engagement. And here's a couple of examples of some of the mine data that you can pull and how we would pull it into the overall the CO2 footprint. And I'm just going to take this as an example through this demo, this still screen demo. But we actually do have this live in our program and can show that later to anyone that would be interested in. So if you look at this, for example, this is from our Department of Energy program, and you can see a layout of a number of different dummy data for different types of battery arrays. And that across all of these arrays, in the back, you would have a different set of data applied or pulled to understand the value of the battery. We have sustainability reporting across all of it, and that can include not just the supply chain tracking, and as I mentioned, third-party verification, and even up to impact data. But as you see under measurements, this is where we get into things like carbon footprint, and eventually we'll also look at water, air pollution, and other things that might be critical for different industries to be tracking across their supply chains. And we categorize these different things in filters that we refer to as badges, but that's just a term for the actual design, but really they're just filters and filter categories for you to be able to search the relevant information that you want in your supply chain. This reporting will then enable you to do yearly reporting and be able to see across all your suppliers things like renewable energy versus total energy output, and also year-on-year climate impact. And we can recategorize this in the back end. Our data scientists work with our technologists on various reporting approaches, and then also different types of layouts. These are things that can be configured per client. If you look up in the top right here, and I'll show you this on individual supplier pages as well, but what we also offer is a connection to the offset. And this can be an offset that's regionalized based on where your impact is. And it can be what you want overall. Maybe you have a particular region that you are dedicated to for various reasons in your company. What we do is we can connect that to your supply chain actors. And then I can also do additional connection and negotiate with different nonprofits and organizations that provide verified offsets. And so that's something that as well we can build in. And so let's just take an example of some of these arrays. And so let's say you have different assessments of state of health of different arrays. Well, you could also be drilling down on each for their specific mine level information. So this is what we refer to as an asset vault view. If you were to take one of the batteries and then track back its history. So I'm going to be going through and just showing you if I were to select one of those arrays or one of those batteries at the parent level, then I would go through and I'd be able to see each one of the steps. And then each one of these steps would have been defined by either direct reporting, or it would have been defined by a third-party report. And you can see that at the bottom here, we've provided an example of where the data was pulled from. And in the future, we would build out different types of flags if you want to only accept, for example, third-party verified data, or if you would accept direct data, or if you would accept self-reported data. There's different ways that we can do that. We were referencing publicly available data for all of these to build this example, but that is something that you can do in the future as well. And then this is an example of just drilling into the specific mine level view. So if you were to pull just one of those out, you'll see that at the bottom, the source is there, the breakdown of the materials there, and then you could be linking your supply chain actors to provide that connection to an offset partner of your choice, of their choice. They could have directly uploaded their offset or their electrical bills here. These are all things that are very doable, and the amount of time it saves in terms of resources as well as actual costs, it builds out quite quickly from my experience managing teams doing these sort of things. And so this is what it could link to. This is just one partner that we did a demo with, and their carbon fund. They have verified different types of offsets. And so we can enable that. It would be a direct link to a page like this of Carbon Fund or another offset partner's site, and they can directly populate it. You can also program things for different percentages of responsibility that different actors might have. This is something that a group like FedEx might do. They might say, we cover X percentage, let's throw out a wild number, but let's say 80% of their shipping costs they cover, but maybe the sender and receiver would split the rest. And those are different ways that people manage carbon footprinting, carbon reporting. Now we just take it and we not only automate it, we enable the things that usually would take much longer or costly, such as private data being shared more readily or different types of data sets being held behind closed doors. And so as you can see, if you look overall, you can have a combination of different actors across the supply chain contributing not only measurement, but also different types of offset to various programs. And that reporting can go to ultimately to a downstream retailer, to a brand, and directly to customers and consumers overall. And with that, please feel free to reach out with any additional questions. Again, this is a very exciting time and a busy time for people. We do believe that with different types of opportunities that we have with our Department of Energy grant, as well as different partnerships we've developed in the mobility sector, that this would be an incredible opportunity to build out a real consensus position and product streams for these activities. Thank you again for your time and looking forward to the Q&A.
So thank you very much, Kerry, for your very interesting presentation. Well, I think you covered a very wide picture about the whole value chain of automobile production. And it is indeed very important to be able to measure what's going on there in the whole production line. We've also seen within the European Green Deal that there is raising concern for all the activity that is going on in the industry. And I can add from my automotive point of view that within the current legislation and automotive sector for cars in the European Union, there is already a mentioning that the supply chain and the life cycle of the car might be addressed. So there is planning on that already, and we'll see what the future will bring us. But thanks very much for presenting your framework on how to measure this. We'll now switch to the questions. And I would like to pass on the first question to you, Kerry, if I may. The first question comes from Belgium. It is, should sustainability reporting not follow globally consistent standards and how best to proceed. Kerry, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. What we're working on right now with several of our partners and the collaborations we have with the Global Battery Alliance and others is to maintain those standards. So what I was referencing in one of the models I showed, the GREET model, that's from the Argonne Labs, the Argonne National Labs in the US, but we can reference any standard of reporting or any specific accepted coefficient that would be part of it. So yes, that's absolutely what we're looking at. What I was referencing in my presentation is not a new approach to measurement, but an efficient approach to measurement and how you report different levels of transparency and data that you have, whether they're IoT enabled, if it's self-declared, how do you declare that and consistently know that, or if it's third-party verified, how we do that. So it's more of the nuts and bolts of what goes on behind the scenes. But yes, we'll absolutely be able to consistently report according to different standards and requirements.
Thank you very much. Then, if I may, I'll have a second question from the audience. Question is from Stephen Taylor, and it's, what standards for data storage and exchange already exist in the space? How hardware and software dependent is your Everledger solution?
This might be slightly repetitive of the last question, but there's several different standards of measurement, as well as what you refer to as the coefficient is. So the coefficient is what you multiply by to get the greenhouse gas measurement from your energy. And so it's based on your material, your protection process, as well as your energy source. And so that's separate reference points that have their own, process for how they determine those energy coefficients. Usually they're determined by government labs or other types of government entities like the Environmental Protection Agency and various governments. So we're referencing those. And yes, there are a number of different standards that are out there. I just mentioned the GREET model because we work closely with that specific national labs, but we're completely neutral to any of the various standards that companies or others would be interested in engaging with or already are using. So most of the models, standing kind of neutrally about it, have various pros and cons and have ways of improvement. Our interest is getting to that scope 3 reporting. As you could see, scope 1 being more of your owned and operated facilities, scope 2 going beyond that to transportation and so on, and then scope 3 getting into your upstream, or for those here, getting into more of your raw material extraction and other areas that are more difficult to typically report your carbon footprint on. Our area, because of the technology and the applications we already have, we will already have many connection points in the upstream, and we also can enable permissioning in a way that is unique through distributed ledger that removes some of the sensitivity that various extractive providers or refiners or those that are farther away from you, from many downstream manufacturers or OEMs, they're more sensitive to disclose that level of detail, and particularly information that would evidence such. So utilities bills and other things. So that's where our engagement in the upstream is particularly useful.
Okay, thank you very much. That sounds indeed like a very powerful tool you're using and providing there. Thank you very much, Kerry, for your presentation, and thank you for answering those two questions. We have the possibility of answering more questions from the audience. Please feel free to post them into the chat, and they will be collected after the session and will be answered at a later stage. Now, we have the next speaker on the line. It is Björn Noack from Bosch. Björn has held various positions at the Bosch Systems Engineering for diesel and petrol powertrains, as well as strategic advisor for the Bosch technology brand. Since 2020, he's been the director of sustainable mobility strategy at Bosch, Bosch Powertrain Solutions. And we are very interested in the presentations of Björn on the topic of how to leave behind fossil fuels. Björn, the stage is yours. We're looking forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you as well. I hope I am audible, just as a check, because I had a lot of issues dialing in.
Yes, you are, and it's perfectly working now. Thanks for trying so hard.
Yeah, I have to apologize, and I also thank for your kind introduction and also the chance to speak in this webinar. I would immediately jump into the next slide, setting the frame. Why do I care about this question, how to leave fossil fuel behind? What is the role of e-fuels? We would assume they need to play there, and what is and how is Bosch contributing or promoting this way to defossilize the powertrains in the vehicle stock. So slide number 1 that I'm presenting right now is a focus on Europe. We see here charts for the primary energy demand as well as the final energy demand. Whatever chart we take, if we look at the graphs, we see oil, gas, solid fuels, you could name it fossil fuels. They play a dominant role in European energy sector, be it in the primary energy demand or in the final energy demand. The next slide is now more focused on Germany. This is where we have most of our expertise in. Of course, we look on European level, also on global level, but Germany is, of course, the easiest for us to access detailed information. And we see here primary energy in Germany is decreasing. The demand is decreasing over the past 10, 15 years. We see a very small reduction of the final energy demand, not as much as we saw it for the primary energy. And we see that in the electricity supply, in the energy supply, the source from biomass was increasing in the between 2000 and 2010. Now it's more stable. We see a rather young increase of wind and photovoltaic energy, and especially the wind and photovoltaic part is expected to grow significantly within the next decades, which would bring us to the right end of this chart here. In 2050, probably we see a significant increase of this energy source. We still can add the biomass to this, and if we also forecast for 2050, according to this DENA scenario plotted here, we see a significant decrease of final energy demand in the next decades, but still we have a huge gap of almost 1 terawatt hour that would need to be filled. And this is for us a very clear sign that at least for Germany, it is very true that we will continue to require energy imports to run our economy in Germany. And I think on a similar level, this would be also true for a European analysis. Exactly, going back to this European analysis and now touching the point, why do we care so much about it? If we look now into the greenhouse gas emissions related to the energy, we see that transport sector has roughly 25% share in it. And going to the right side of this diagram, this chart here, we see how this builds up between various transport sectors. And Bosch Powertrain Solutions, we are active in motorcycles, heavy-duty vehicles, buses, light-duty vehicles and passenger cars. And naming all of them, I almost ran all across this circle, though it means 3/4 of it is also connected to our portfolio in the future. And if we want to really meet climate targets, if we really want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, transport sector is 1/4, and out of it 3/4 is affected also by our portfolio. And this means it's highly interesting for us to find solution. And this was a picture for now. If we now dare another forecast into the future on a more global scale, not only Europe, we do see that both transport demands are forecasted to increase. On the left side, we see the passenger transport, which is expected to increase, and a further, well, even steeper increase we see for freight transport. And I think it's also for the topic of e-fuels and the cooperation between electric vehicles and combustion engine-driven vehicles. It's interesting to take a deeper look into the passenger transport mode. We have here a split between urban public, urban private, and non-urban road. All subsectors are increasing, but I think it's easy to see that the non-urban road transportation in passenger transport is increasing on a steepest rate. And this is exactly one area in the passenger car sector, for example, where electrification comes at a very high cost and is probably not feasible for all use cases. So this means we would definitely need something next to the battery electric vehicles, not only from an energy perspective, remember the previous charts, but also the use case of long distance driving with probably short time to refuel or recharge is expected to increase over the next decades. And this is also then reflected in our projections of the future when it comes to what we call powertrain scenarios. So for our planning at Bosch Powertrain Solutions, we try to anticipate the future new registrations of vehicle and also align to this projections our planning in terms of product portfolio as well as plants and capacities. And we do so in various scenarios. We have taken out here 2 of them. We start in 2020 with an evolutionary scenario, which would lead us in 2025 to almost half of the vehicles new registered in Europe would be pure ICE. Almost 30% would have a 48-volt electrification next to the ICE, and then we see the pure electric vehicle BEV. We see plug-in hybrids, and we see a very niche application of fuel cell electric vehicles, which only grows in 2030. And for 2030, we have now 2 scenarios. One is a continuation of the evolutionary scenario, which still show us 1/3 of the new registrations is pure ICE engine in Europe by 2030. Still, there's 30% 48-volt electrification, and now it's a remarkable share of battery electric vehicle that sums up to 23%. And we could be even more optimistic in our most optimistic scenario, actually, assuming that the battery prices keep on falling at a very steep rate, assuming that consumers would accept a limited all-electric drive range, and assuming that there is no limitation in terms of recharging infrastructure for battery electric vehicles. We could also assume that there is almost half of the European vehicles that are registered as battery electric vehicles. But even in this scenario, we still have 1/3 of the market with a combustion engine, of course, with an integrated 48-volt drive. So in this optimistic scenario, almost half of new registrations would be battery electric vehicles, showing no tailpipe CO2 emissions. But the next slide shows us another truth. If on the left side we start with a sales share of 47% battery electric vehicles, if you go to the next column here representing the fleet composition by 2030 in this scenario, in this most optimistic scenario, we see that this market is not at a high renewal rate. Still in 2030, we would expect 58% pure ICEs in the market. Average vehicle age in European market, passenger car and light duty vehicle is more than 10 years, and this explains easily why we see this phenomena, that 47% new registrations only lead to 18% in the vehicle stock by 2030. Now we go to, I think, the core part of this whole presentation. If now from this virtual scenarios calculated fleet compositions, we would assume that coming from 2020 base of 650 million tons CO2 emissions, we would increase the fleet a little bit and add 28 million additional tons of CO2 emissions. We also account for a model shift, so probably higher utilization of public transportation modes, which could reduce 81% of 81 million tons of CO2. Finally, then passenger cars, light-duty vehicles would emit 600 million tons of CO2 if we would not have electric vehicles. We see we have 18% electric vehicles, and this would reduce 117 million tons. Not sufficient, because if we take a virtual target in 2030 of probably 40% CO2 emissions less compared to 1990, we still have to overcome a gap of 162 million tons, which we cannot manage by the technology change in new registered vehicles. So definitely we need an option to work with vehicle stock. We need to defossilize the fuels and go to renewable fuels. 160 million tons would equal roughly 60 million tons of renewable fuels, which would mean 40% of the fuels sold and used in Europe for passenger car, light duty vehicle would need to be renewable fuels, not of a fossil origin.
Björn, can I pause you just one moment, please? There is a request from the audience that you alter your microphone a little bit. It's very difficult to understand you. If you might be able to change it just slightly so we can hear you a little bit better. Thank you.
I do a test. Better now?
Oh, that is a lot better. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. Thanks for the hint. Again, basic message or final message from this slide. E-fuels is not a nice to have option, technology fancy stuff. E-fuels are mandatory if you really take climate targets seriously and if you really want to achieve climate targets with transport sector. And e-fuels are not too complicated, in fact, to be produced or manufactured, though it's all starts on the left side with renewable energy. If we take fossil sources to produce electric energy, then the whole story won't work. So we need 100% renewable energy. Out of this, we produce hydrogen, renewable green hydrogen, which would be the simplest e-fuel as it on its own. But of course, it would not be a drop-in fuel, how we call it. So the vehicle stock couldn't use it. But this hydrogen is the most important precursor for all e-fuels, gas or liquid e-fuels. We need additional carbon to feature this. We could take the carbon from an industrial exhaust in the short term. Long term, of course, direct air capturing is very interesting. And if we do so, we have a closed loop carbon cycle, which wouldn't increase the climate warming or the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. And out of the two ingredients, hydrogen and carbon, we would then go into the synthesis and have our e-fuels. 2020 production will start already, of course, on a rather small scale, and it would be very important to scale it up to have sufficient supplies and also to enable target prices significantly below €2 per liter. And the bottom line here, you see again, you can produce a huge variety of hydrocarbons out of this process. For us, it's important that we have drop-in fuels, e-gasoline, e-diesel, e-methane, and for aviation, of course, also e-kerosene.
I'm sorry if I interrupt you one more time. The audio was very good for a short moment of time and then went back to bad. Maybe you have to move the microphone a little bit again. We try it again because we're very eager to listen to what you're saying.
Sadly, it's almost inside my mouth. I would expect it's a more technical problem. It's better now.
Now it's better. Yes, now it's better. If it can keep like that, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I will freeze myself, not move anymore.
Sorry for that.
This next slide here is now also giving an answer to the often highlighted topic of the production efficiency of e-fuels. So if we take renewable electricity and then convert it via all these process steps into e-fuel, this is on a rather low efficiency. And yes, I think we can agree on this. If we walk from top down through this chart, we see that today our battery electric vehicles driven by, for example, wind or solar power, which is regionally produced in Germany, they come to a well-to-wheel efficiency of about 55%. And on the other side, we see our combustion engine, which runs on fossil fuels produced outside of Germany, transported by ship, for example, to Germany, finally refined and distributed, combusted or burned in the combustion engine. We come at only 30%. And if we go to tomorrow's world, we see that the production of e-fuels in, for example, Australia, as marked here, would lead to further losses in the entire production chain. So finally, well to wheel, we would have only an efficiency of 22%, which is, of course, lower than the 55% that the battery electric vehicle would have. But we saw already that our potential is limited in Germany and also in Europe. Oh, sorry, there's one animation missing in this. This is why we believe if we would need to import electric energy anyways, and if we would import it via chemical carriers such as e-fuels or e-crudes, and then do a reconversion into electric power, also the battery electric vehicles will show roughly 22% of overall well-to-wheel efficiency. And then it doesn't matter whether we go on battery electric vehicle or on the e-fuel part. And e-fuels, of course, are already now compatible with the infrastructure and would provide an option, as we have seen, for the vehicle stock to defossilize. Of course, this is then a picture driven by passenger cars, also trucks. So it's very in the near term where we need a solution for the vehicle stock. On the long run, it is also expected that the aviation and shipping sector might use e-fuels to decarbonize, which they are right now not prepared to consume. And this means if in the future our vehicle stock problems in 20, 30 years is solved by the new registration vehicles with advanced powertrains or alternative powertrains, then it might be that the demand of e-fuels goes down over the time, but by then we can still use the investments done in the production of e-fuels in aviation and shipping. And I heard in the previous presentation already something about the life cycle assessment, although this is of course relevant for the e-fuels. In this chart we see a gasoline vehicle today driven by fossil fuels has the highest contribution to the life cycle emission during the utilization phase here. If we convert this into fueling with e-fuel, it's almost negligible. And as for the BEV, the focus would then be on the production phase of a vehicle, which would mean we do not need to focus too much on the use phase of the vehicles. Last point, I think I'm already over the time. What do? We are not, of course, producing the e-fuels. We are supporting any activities to show that those e-fuels, synthetic fuels, are compatible with today's products from Bosch, with today's vehicles on the market, that they have no negative influence on emissions at all, that they are indeed CO2 neutral, and we also fuel our own company cars and our internal fueling stations already, for example, with synthetic fuels, according to this EN 15940. And we are also using blends of synthetic fuels inside the accepted norms in Germany to run our company cars. And by this, I would close the presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Björn, for this very interesting and insightful presentation. Now, my apologies go to all of the audience for the slightly disrupted audio we had. Maybe, Björn, if you could try to change the plug of your microphone, maybe that helps a little bit, because we have some questions for you, and maybe we'll be able to understand the questions even better than we understood your presentation. Now, my first
it's USB,
question...
it's digital interface.
All right, okay, yes, so that won't help then, but it's better now. So we try to keep the connection like this, and maybe it's better then. The first question comes from Tyler Folsom. His question is about ultralight vehicles. So the idea he has is the assumption seems to be that a vehicle stays the same in terms of weight. Have you investigated the energy savings that come from ultralight vehicles, so lightweighting? And if I may add to this, can you also refer what the legislative and regulative framework says about ultralight weighting at the moment?
Yeah, in our scenarios, indeed, we work with today's categories of vehicles, and we take for each of the categories an average weight. So there's not much of an ultra low weight vehicle category inside. If we would put it, for sure, the annual fuel consumption would reduce, and by this also the CO2 emission of those new registered vehicles will reduce. And this is also reflected, I think, in today's regulation. So the targets that vehicle manufacturers receive from the European Commission, they are of course related to their average fleet's weight that they sell and register in the market. And if they reduce the weight, they will also receive reduced CO2 limits for the entire fleet.
So that means the average fleet is taken ex post in the legislation, and the target stays the same overall. That's the so-called M0 continuation, right, in the legislation.
Yeah.
So to make it clear, in the European Union legislative framework, a change of average vehicle mass would not change the average CO2 emissions, because it's adjusted every 3 years to the current average weight. And
the emission targets. Yeah. The real emission, of course, but the targets won't change so fast.
Yes, yeah. I'm just emphasizing it because I've heard that question many times. So within the legislative framework, lightweight vehicles would not change the overall emissions, really. Now, we have some more questions, but as long as I collect those questions, I'd like to encourage everybody to post more questions into the chat. None of the questions will be lost. They will all be part of a post-event blog, and you can post questions either to Björn or to Carrie. My next question comes from Tim Wallington. Is continued use of petroleum combined with carbon capture and storage a third option that should be included in the analysis? If we go to the trouble of gathering carbon or e-fuel synthesis, we could alternatively just sequester the carbon. I'm not quite sure how this is meant. Maybe Björn, you've got an idea. I don't know if we can collect the carbon from the tailpipe of the vehicle, but maybe you've got an idea on that.
I can only assume, and I would assume the question hints to the refineries and the reformation process of the fuels. So even there, we are emitting CO2, and this could be captured, and by this, the greenhouse gas intensity of each unit of fuel produced would reduce. but it won't come to zero. And
Yes.
the nice approach of a production chain for e-fuels using direct air capturing, for example, would of course also set a path that in the future we could also actively reduce the concentration of carbon dioxide concentration in atmosphere by technical means. So I think this is a more sustainable path than reducing the CO2 emission in the refinery process of crudes.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is, upon the rising overall worldwide demand in mobility, and along with that goes a rising demand for materials, raw materials, energy and resources. And we've already seen a shortage in certain raw materials, troubles to source, for instance, raw materials for batteries. Can you give us an insight on what the raw material side looks like? If there are some bottlenecks on e-fuels material or materials used in batteries?
I would like to focus the answer on the e-fuels, and indeed also in e-fuels we need to carefully look, do we have raw materials there that could become a bottleneck when we really scale it up? And there are some. So if we, for example, focus completely on photovoltaic energy, of course we need to take a look at the production of solar modules, photovoltaic modules. I think it is not as critical today as we see it for batteries. And in the electrolysis process, of course, also we have precious metals in the electrodes of the machine, which are indeed right now really a scarce source. So there we need to improve the equipment and the processes so that the future electrolyzers run with significantly lower loading of precious metals. So this would be for me right now the two bottlenecks when it comes to raw materials in the e-fuel production chain.
And if you combine this, if you compare this to electric mobility, where do you see more bottlenecks or more dangerous supply chain situations?
Right now, I would think it's simply due to the mass involved and being battery cells being something like a consumable. I would assume in the battery electric part, it is probably a little more difficult than in the e-fuels.
Okay. Thank you. So last question live, and all the other questions will be part of the post-event blog. Last question is, how do you see the availability of e-fuels developing, and what is the necessary legislation change to make the whole system of e-fuels viable?
The first easiest step we need to take in terms of legislation, those synthetic fuels, they need to be inside the norms. And when we talk about diesel, for example, we need also the paraffinic fuels to be accepted in all the markets, which would mean we need to accept EN 15940 norms so that we can easily fuel all those products into the market. I think in the beginning to provide investors a secure atmosphere that the scaling up of production is not a too high risk, a ambitious share of renewable energy in our renewable energy directive would be very important. And this could be even supported by crediting e-fuel certificates also for the vehicle manufacturers when it comes to reaching their own individual fleet targets, so that there is an additional market impulse in the scaling up of production. But all of this is still the pure regulation side. I think we need to make them competitive with fossil fuels, and as per their nature, they are more costly than the fossil ones. I have shown here that we want to come significantly below €2. Today we have almost half or roughly half a euro production cost for fossil fuels. So without a reasonable price on CO2 for fossil sources, well to tank, and without a proper regulation on the energy taxation, this would not be a chance on the free market in the long run for the e-fuels.
Okay, thank you very much, Björn. Thanks for your presentation. Thanks for answering all the questions. And it's great that we solved the technical issues in the end. Thanks once again very much to Carrie for your very interesting and insightful presentation. And last but not least, thanks a lot to Philippa and her team from FISITA for organizing all this in such a perfect manner. We will collect or Philippa and her team will collect all the questions and post them afterwards. And now my final words would be, if you'd like to be part of the ongoing conversation around sustainable mobility, consider joining FISITA and attending the member and special invited guest discussions at the FISITA Forum and World Mobility Summit in the next few months. For more information, just go to the FISITA website. Right, that is it for today. Thank you very much for attending this event. Thanks a lot to the presenters, and we'll hear you in the near future. Goodbye from Berlin, and see you next time.